It started with an innocuous knock on the door. It was a chilly November evening, and I had just settled into my living room for a quiet night in. The wind howled outside, and I was grateful to be warm inside my small but cozy house. My neighborhood was peaceful, located on the outskirts of town where everyone knew each other, or so I thought. The knock was soft at first, almost like a tapping, barely audible over the wind. I wasn't expecting anyone and found it odd that someone would be out on a night like this. My curiosity piqued. I got up, peeking through the curtains of my front window. There was no one in sight, only the dim glow of the streetlight illuminating the empty road. I hesitated, considering the possibility that it might have just been the wind rattling something against the door. But then, the knock came again, this time louder, more deliberate. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a chill creep up my spine. Who could possibly be out here at this hour? I approached the door cautiously, my hand hovering over the knob for a moment before I finally turned it and opened the door just a crack. Standing in the doorway was a man, drenched from the rain, his hair plastered to his forehead. He had the look of someone in distress, his eyes wide and pleading. His clothes were soaked through, and he shivered from the cold. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can I come in? My car broke down, and I have nowhere else to go." His words came out in short breaths, each one laced with desperation. He looked harmless enough, but something about the situation made me uneasy. I knew I shouldn't let strangers in, especially late at night, but I couldn't just leave him out there in the cold. My instincts screamed at me to close the door and lock it, but my sense of decency overruled my fear. "Just for a little while," I said, stepping aside to let him in. He nodded gratefully and stepped inside, bringing with him a gust of cold, damp air. I shut the door behind him and locked it, an action that gave me little comfort. The man stood in the entryway, dripping onto the floor, his arms wrapped around himself for warmth. I led him into the living room, where the fireplace crackled softly, casting a warm glow around the room. He stood awkwardly by the hearth, glancing around as though he were unsure where to sit, or if he should sit at all. "Do you want a towel?" I asked, trying to ease the tension. He nodded again, still shivering. I hurried to the bathroom and grabbed a towel, my mind racing with thoughts. Who was this man? Why had he chosen my house to knock on? The neighborhood was full of homes, many closer to the main road. Why mine? When I returned, he had sat down on the edge of the couch, his hands outstretched toward the fire, trying to soak up any warmth he could. I handed him the towel, and he muttered a quick thank you before drying his face and hair. "Do you need to call a tow truck or anything?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation light. "No, that's all right," he said, his voice low. "I just need to warm up. I'll be on my way soon." I nodded, though a part of me doubted his words. Something about his demeanor felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. He looked like a man who had been through some kind of ordeal, but whether that was just from the storm outside or something more, I didn't know. I sat across from him, watching as he dried himself off and stared into the fire. The silence between us grew heavier with each passing minute, and the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the house as the wind battered against it. "So, where are you headed?" I asked, trying to break the awkwardness. He hesitated before answering. "Just passing through." His answer was vague, and I could tell he didn't want to share much about himself. I wasn't going to press him for details, but the unease I felt earlier was growing. I couldn't help but glance at the clock, wondering how long he planned to stay. It was late, and I wanted nothing more than to crawl into bed and forget this strange encounter. Suddenly, he stood up. The movement startled me, and I flinched slightly. "I should go," he said, his voice firm but hollow. "Thank you for your kindness." He grabbed the towel and tossed it onto the couch before heading toward the door. I followed, wanting to make sure he actually left. Something about his abrupt departure felt wrong. He reached the door and paused, his hand resting on the doorknob for a moment. Then, without another word, he opened the door and disappeared into the night. I stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door, listening to the wind howl outside. The man was gone, but the tension in the air lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had just brushed past me. I tried to go to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind kept replaying the events of the evening. Who was that man? Where had he come from? Why had he chosen my house? I tossed and turned for hours, finally dozing off just before dawn. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was my neighbor, Jane, calling. "Hey, did you hear what happened last night?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "No," I said, still groggy. "What happened?" "There was a break-in down the street, at the Morrisons' house. They found the husband tied up in the basement. He said someone broke in and held them hostage all night." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. "Did they catch the guy?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "No," Jane said. "The police think he's still in the neighborhood." I hung up the phone, my mind reeling. The man from last night flashed through my thoughts. Could it have been him? The way he had knocked on my door, the way he had left so abruptly, it all seemed too coincidental. I rushed to the front door, hoping to find some kind of clue, something to confirm or deny my suspicions. But the entryway was empty, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I called the police, telling them about the man who had knocked on my door. They asked for a description, but I realized I hadn't really gotten a good look at his face. It had been dark, and his hair had been wet, covering most of his features. I gave them what little information I could, but it didn't seem like enough. Days passed, and the tension in the neighborhood grew. Everyone was on edge, locking their doors and windows, watching the street for any sign of the intruder. The police continued to search for the man, but he seemed to have vanished without a trace. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. If I hadn't let him in, would he have broken in anyway? Would I have ended up like the Morrisons, tied up and helpless in my own home? A week later, I was sitting in my living room when there was another knock at the door. My heart stopped. I froze in place, staring at the door, my mind racing. Could it be him again? Slowly, I got up and approached the door, peeking through the peephole. There was no one there. Another knock, this time louder. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in short gasps. I knew I should call the police, but something held me back. Something told me that whoever, or whatever, was knocking wouldn't be deterred by the police. The knocking grew more insistent, almost frantic. I pressed myself against the wall, my eyes wide with fear. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence filled the house, thick and oppressive. I waited for what felt like hours, my body tense, expecting the worst. But nothing happened. Eventually, I gathered the courage to open the door. I stepped outside, the cool night air washing over me. The street was empty. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints in the damp grass, no indication that anyone had been there at all. I went back inside, locking the door behind me, but the feeling of dread didn't leave. It clung to me, suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. I haven't heard the knocking since. But every night, I sit by the window, watching the street, waiting for the uninvited guest to return. Because I know deep down that he's still out there. And the next time, I might not be so lucky. I never thought much about the attic in my house. It was one of those spaces I knew existed, but I never felt the need to go up there. After all, it was just a dusty old place, right? I lived alone in a house I'd inherited from my grandparents. They'd passed away a few years ago, and since the house was fully paid off, I figured it was better to stay here than move to some expensive apartment in the city. The first few months were peaceful. I enjoyed the quiet suburban life, working from home most days, with occasional trips to the grocery store or a weekend movie. I'd get visits from my neighbors now and then, but for the most part, my life was solitary, which suited me just fine. That all changed one chilly winter evening. It started with small, almost imperceptible noises, soft creaks and groans in the ceiling. I chalked it up to the house settling, something that had happened before, especially during colder weather. But over the next few days, the noises became more distinct. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. At first, I thought I was imagining things. I mean, it's easy to get spooked when you're alone in a big, quiet house. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself that it was just the pipes, or maybe a stray animal crawling around up there. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. One night, as I sat on the couch watching TV, the footsteps became louder, more pronounced, like someone pacing directly above me. My heart began to race, and my stomach twisted with fear. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but something stopped me. Maybe it was embarrassment. I didn't want to be the person who called the cops over some creaky floorboards. Instead, I grabbed a flashlight and decided to investigate. The attic entrance was located in the hallway, a small hatch in the ceiling with a pulled-down ladder. I hadn't been up there since I'd moved in, and part of me dreaded what I might find. But I couldn't live like this, constantly scared of my own house. I had to know what was causing those noises. I pulled the ladder down, and it creaked under my weight as I climbed up into the attic. The air was cold and musty, the kind of smell that clung to old cardboard boxes and forgotten furniture. I swept the beam of the flashlight across the attic, revealing piles of junk my grandparents had stored up here over the years, old photo albums, rusted tools, and stacks of newspapers. Nothing out of the ordinary, but then the beam of my flashlight landed on something strange, a small bed, neatly made with a threadbare blanket and a flat pillow. My blood ran cold. I hadn't put that bed there. In fact, I had no idea it even existed. It was tucked away in a far corner of the attic, almost hidden behind a stack of boxes. I walked over to it, my hands trembling as I shone the light around. Next to the bed was a small knitstand, and on it sat an empty bowl and a half-full bottle of water. Whoever had been staying up here had been living off my food and water without me even knowing. I felt sick. Someone had been in my house, living in my attic, sneaking down while I slept or went out to get supplies. I immediately ran back down the ladder, my heart pounding in my chest. I locked every door and window in the house, double checking that everything was secure. I even grabbed a kitchen knife and kept it by my side as I sat on the couch, trying to figure out what to do. Whoever had been up there wasn't there now, but they could come back at any time. I should have called the police right then and there, but I was too scared, too shocked to think straight. Instead, I stayed up all night, listening for any sound, any hint that the intruder might return. The next morning, I went to the hardware store and bought new locks for every door. I also picked up some security cameras, hoping that they would give me some peace of mind. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that the person living in the attic had left for good, that I wouldn't hear those footsteps again. But I was wrong. One night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it. The sound of the attic ladder being pulled down, the faint creak of someone descending the steps. My blood turned to ice. I lay frozen in bed, barely breathing, as the footsteps grew louder, closer. Whoever was in my house wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. They knew I was here. The footsteps stopped outside my bedroom door. My heart pounded so hard I was sure the intruder could hear it. I clutched the kitchen knife I'd kept on my nightstand, my hand shaking. Then, the doorknob slowly began to turn. I don't know what came over me, but in that moment, something snapped. I jumped out of bed, flung the door open, and brandished a knife in front of me, ready to fight for my life. But there was no one there. The hallway was empty. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening, waiting for any sign of movement, but the house was silent. Slowly, I lowered the knife and walked down the hallway, checking every room, every corner. No one was there. I should have felt relieved, but I didn't. The house felt wrong, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. I packed a bag and left that night, driving to a hotel on the other side of town. The next day, I called the police. They came and searched the house, including the attic, but they didn't find anything. The bed, the bowl, the water bottle, it was all gone, as if it had never been there in the first place. The officers assured me that no one had been living in the house, that it was probably just my imagination, but I knew better. I knew what I had seen. I moved out of the house a week later, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the intruder was still there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for me to come back. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling of dread that followed me from that house. I still hear those footsteps sometimes, in the middle of the night, when the world is quiet and still. And I wonder if whoever was living in my attic has found a new place to hide, a new victim to torment. Because I know deep down that they're still out there, waiting for their next opportunity to strike. It had been 2 years since my divorce, and I finally felt ready to move on. I wanted a fresh start in a new place. When I stumbled upon the charming old Victorian home on the edge of town, it seemed like the perfect fit. It was quiet, secluded, and surrounded by tall trees that provided an escape from the hustle and bustle of city life. The house had been on the market for a while, and after some negotiation, I managed to get it for a steal. It was bigger than what I needed, but I liked the idea of having extra space. The previous owners hadn't done much upkeep, so the house had a slightly worn down look to it, but I was eager to make it my own. I spent the first few days cleaning and unpacking. There was a lot of work to do, but I was excited about the possibilities. I felt a sense of peace as I arranged my furniture, hung up photos, and decorated each room to my liking. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly at home. But that feeling didn't last long. It started innocently enough, just small, easily dismissible things. I'd leave a room, come back, and find that something had been moved slightly, like a picture frame tilted or a chair pushed a few inches out of place. I figured I was just tired from the move and hadn't noticed the details. Maybe I was the one who'd moved them and forgot. But the occurrences became more frequent, and the changes became more noticeable. One evening, I was sitting in the living room, trying to relax after a long day of organizing. As I scrolled through my phone, I heard a soft thump upstairs. I paused, listening intently. It sounded like something had fallen, but I hadn't left anything up there that could make such a noise. Cautiously, I climbed the stairs and checked each room. Everything was in place. I shrugged it off as the house settling and went back to my chair, convincing myself it was nothing to worry about. The next morning, though, I woke up to find my bedroom door ajar. I always made sure to close it before going to bed, a habit I had kept for years. Yet, there it was, open just a crack. The air in the house felt colder than usual, and I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something was wrong. I started to wonder if maybe there was more to this house than I initially thought. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences intensified. Footsteps echoed down the hallways at night, even though I was the only one living there. Lights flickered unpredictably, and items continued to be moved around. One evening, as I was cooking dinner, I felt a cold draft brush past me, as though someone had walked through the kitchen. I froze, the hairs on my neck standing on end. There were no windows open, and I hadn't turned on the fan. I stood there, staring at the empty room, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. I didn't want to admit it, but I was starting to get scared. I couldn't rationalize what was happening anymore. Something wasn't right in that house, and it was becoming impossible to ignore. One night, I woke up to the sound of heavy breathing. At first, I thought it was my own, but then I realized it was coming from outside my bedroom door. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay frozen under the covers listening. The breathing was slow, deliberate, and disturbingly close. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it would go away, but the sound only grew louder, more pronounced. I knew I had to do something, but I was too terrified to move. After what felt like hours, the breathing finally stopped. I lay there, drenched in sweat, my mind racing. I tried to rationalize what I had just heard, but there was no logical explanation. Something or someone was in my house. The next morning, I called a locksmith and had all the locks changed. I also installed new security cameras around the property, hoping that would put my mind at ease. But even with the new locks and cameras, the feeling of being watched never went away. One evening, while reviewing the footage from the cameras, I noticed something chilling. In one of the clips, taken around 3 a.m., I saw a shadowy figure moving across the backyard. The figure was tall, with broad shoulders, and it moved slowly toward the house. My heart sank as I watched the figure stop just outside my bedroom window before disappearing from view. I rewound the footage, watching it again and again, hoping it was just a trick of the light. But it wasn't. Someone had been watching me while I slept. I immediately called the police and showed them the footage. They did a thorough sweep of the property but found no signs of forced entry or any evidence that someone had been inside the house. The officers assured me they would increase patrols in the area, but their words did little to comfort me. I knew something wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever, or whatever, was watching me wasn't done yet. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every gust of wind sent me into a panic. I kept my phone by my side, ready to call the police at a moment's notice. But the house was eerily silent, as if it, too, was waiting for something to happen. The next morning, I woke up feeling exhausted and on edge. I decided to take a day off work to try and clear my head. I went out for a walk, hoping the fresh air would help, but even outside, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me, lurking just out of sight. When I returned home, I found something that sent chills down my spine. On the kitchen counter, in neat handwriting, was a note that simply said, "You can't hide from me." I stood there, staring at the note, my hands trembling. I hadn't left it there, and no one had been in the house all day. I checked the security footage again, but there was nothing. No one had come in or out since I'd left that morning. Panic surged through me as I realized the intruder wasn't just someone sneaking around outside. They were already inside the house, and they had been for a long time. I packed a bag and left the house that night, too scared to stay another minute. I checked into a hotel and called the police again, but they couldn't find any evidence of a break-in. The house was locked up tight, and there were no signs of forced entry. I haven't gone back to that house since. I sold it within a month and moved to a different city, far away from the memories of that place. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the sound of slow, deliberate breathing, and I can't help but wonder if the intruder followed me. Because no matter where I go, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. After months of searching for a home, Emily and her husband, Greg, found a charming two-story house in a quiet, suburban neighborhood. It wasn't perfect. It had a bit of an old, worn-out vibe, but it was affordable and had potential. The real estate agent told them the house had been vacant for a while, which explained why it was listed so low. They couldn't resist the deal, and within weeks they moved in. From the moment they stepped inside, Emily noticed something strange about the house. There was an odd heaviness in the air, almost as if the house itself was alive. The attic, in particular, gave her an unsettling feeling. It was dark and cramped, with old wooden beams creaking above. A thick layer of dust covered the floor, and there were a few old boxes piled in the corner, left behind by the previous owners. Every time Emily walked past the attic door, she could swear she heard faint sounds, scratching, shuffling, like something moving up there. Greg brushed it off as the house settling, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. It wasn't long before the noises grew more noticeable. Late at night, after they had gone to bed, Emily would lie awake, listening to the sounds above them. It started with the occasional creak or thud, but over time, it became more distinct, footsteps pacing back and forth across the attic floor. Sometimes, she would hear what sounded like furniture being dragged across the room. It was as if someone was living up there, moving around while they slept. She brought it up to Greg several times, but he dismissed her concerns, insisting it was just an old house making old house noises. One night, the noises were louder than usual. Emily sat up in bed, her heart racing. The sound of footsteps echoed directly above their bedroom, slow and deliberate, as if someone was pacing in a small circle. She nudged Greg awake, but by the time he was alert, the footsteps had stopped. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, her voice shaky. Greg rubbed his eyes and sighed. "It's just the house, Emily. Go back to sleep." But Emily couldn't. She lay awake for hours, listening for the footsteps to return, but the house remained silent. The following day, she decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, she climbed the narrow staircase that led to the attic. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew lingered in the air. She stepped cautiously onto the creaky wooden floor, shining her light into every corner. The attic was as she remembered, dark, empty, with nothing but a few old boxes left behind. She sighed, feeling a bit foolish for letting her imagination get the best of her. Just as she was about to leave, something caught her eye, a piece of paper sticking out from one of the boxes in the corner. Curious, she knelt down and pulled it out. It was an old photograph, yellowed with age. The image was of a family, mother, father, and two children, standing in front of the house. But something was off. In the background, just behind the family, Emily could make out a faint figure in one of the windows, a tall, shadowy figure with glowing eyes staring directly at the camera. A chill ran down her spine. She quickly shoved the photo back into the box and hurried downstairs, her mind racing. Who was that figure in the window? Had someone else lived in the house before them? She tried to push the thoughts out of her head, but the image of those glowing eyes lingered. Over the next few weeks, the activity in the house intensified. The footsteps grew louder, more frequent, and the strange sounds in the attic became harder to ignore. One night, while Greg was working late, Emily was sitting on the couch reading a book when she heard it again, footsteps. But this time they were coming down the attic stairs. Her breath caught in her throat as she listened, frozen in place. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, growing closer and closer to the door at the top of the staircase. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, as if something had slammed against the attic door. Emily jumped to her feet, her heart racing. She grabbed her phone and called Greg, her voice trembling as she explained what had happened. "I swear, Greg, someone's in the house." "It's coming from the attic." Greg, still at work, tried to calm her down. "Emily, it's probably just the wind. I'll check it out when I get home. Just try to relax, okay?" But Emily couldn't relax. She paced the living room, glancing nervously at the attic door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. After what felt like hours, Greg finally came home. He grabbed a flashlight and headed up to the attic, but as expected, he found nothing. The attic was empty, just as it had always been. Despite Greg's reassurances, Emily's fear continued to grow. The footsteps, the banging, the strange noises, it all felt too real to be just the house settling. And then, one night, something happened that made Emily question her own sanity. She was lying in bed, unable to sleep, when she heard a faint whisper. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but as she lay there, the whisper grew louder. It was coming from the attic, but it wasn't just one voice. It was several, all speaking at once, their words indecipherable but laced with malice. Emily clutched the blankets, too terrified to move. The whispers grew louder and more frantic until, suddenly, they stopped. Emily sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. She was drenched in sweat, her hands shaking. She knew she couldn't stay in the house any longer. Something was in the attic, something dark and malevolent, and it wasn't going to leave her alone. The next morning, Emily told Greg she wanted to move. He was hesitant at first, but after seeing the fear in her eyes, he reluctantly agreed. They put the house up for sale, and within a few weeks, they had a beer. Emily felt a sense of relief as they packed up their belongings and prepared to leave. On their last day in the house, Emily decided to take one last look in the attic. She climbed the stairs, her heart racing, and opened the door. The attic was just as it had always been, dark, empty, and unsettling. But as she turned to leave, she heard it again, the soft, malevolent whispering. She froze, her blood running cold. Slowly, she turned back to face the attic. In the far corner of the room, she saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the darkness, its glowing eyes fixed on her. Emily didn't wait to see what would happen next. She bolted down the stairs, slamming the door behind her. She never looked back. They moved out of the house the next day, leaving the attic and whatever was lurking inside behind. But Emily knew deep down that the house wasn't done with her. It was still watching, waiting for its next victim to move in. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, the kind where I could disconnect from work and just relax in my cozy new home. I had recently moved to the outskirts of town, far enough from the hustle and bustle but close enough that a quick drive could get me back to civilization. It wasn't anything fancy, a modest, two-bedroom house that sat on an acre of land, surrounded by trees and silence. The only neighbors were a couple miles down the road, and I liked the isolation. I craved it, actually, after living in a city for so long. The move had been smooth, and the first few nights were peaceful. I reveled in the quiet, enjoying the stillness that was so hard to find in a crowded city. However, the sense of peace didn't last long. It started with small things that were easy to brush off as coincidence or forgetfulness. One morning, I noticed my kitchen window slightly open. I was sure I had closed it the night before, but I chalked it up to a draft or my own carelessness. A few days later, I found the front door unlocked when I was certain I had locked it before going to bed. Again, I dismissed it as an accident. Then, one evening, I heard footsteps outside. I was sitting in the living room, watching TV, when the sound caught my attention. Slow, deliberate steps crunching on the gravel outside the house. I muted the television and listened, my heart beating a little faster. The footsteps continued, moving around the side of the house, but they were faint, like whoever was walking was trying to keep their presence unknown. I moved to the window and peered out, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing, just the shadows of the trees swaying in the evening breeze. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That I heard footsteps but saw nothing. It seemed too vague to warrant a report. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, watching. A week went by without incident, and I tried to convince myself it had all been in my head. Maybe it was a deer or some other animal that had caused the noise. I kept telling myself it was nothing, even though the uneasy feeling in my stomach wouldn't go away. Then, one night, everything changed. I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard a noise that jolted me fully awake. It was a soft scraping sound, like metal against wood. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, but as I lay there, frozen, I realized it was coming from inside the house. The sound was coming from downstairs. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up and strained to listen. The scraping sound continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone was dragging something across the floor. I reached for my phone, but before I could dial 911, the noise stopped. Silence. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my breath shallow, ears straining for any other sound. But there was nothing, just the oppressive quiet of the house. I couldn't stay in bed any longer. I had to know what was making that sound. Grabbing the baseball bat I kept under my bed, I slowly crept downstairs, my phone clutched in my other hand, ready to call for help if needed. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I scanned the living room, the kitchen, the front hallway. Everything was exactly as I had left it. No sign of forced entry, no objects moved. I stood in the middle of the room, bat in hand, feeling both relieved and confused. Maybe it had been a dream, a trick of my mind half asleep. I started to turn back toward the stairs when I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The back door was open. It wasn't wide open, just enough for someone to slip through, but I knew for a fact I had locked it before going to bed. I approached it slowly, feeling the cold night air seep through the crack. My mind raced with possibilities. Had someone been in the house? Were they still here? I slammed the door shut and locked it, checking it twice before retreating back upstairs. I barely slept that night, every creak of the house making my heart jump. The next morning, I called a locksmith to change all the locks. I even installed a security system, hoping it would give me some peace of mind. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. In fact, they got worse. One night, while I was watching TV, the power suddenly went out. At first, I thought it was a neighborhood outage, but when I looked outside, the houses down the road still had their lights on. It was just my house that was plunged into darkness. I grabbed a flashlight and went to check the breaker box. As I stepped outside to reach the panel, I heard it again, the slow, deliberate footsteps on the gravel. I shone my flashlight around, but there was nothing. No one was there. My skin prickled with fear. I hurried to the breaker box, flipped the switches, and the power came back on. But as I turned to head back inside, something caught my eye. On the side of the house, just outside the living room window, were fresh footprints in the gravel. I hadn't been imagining it. Someone had been there, standing right outside my window, watching me. I called the police that night, but they found nothing. No fingerprints, no sign of forced entry, nothing. The officers told me to keep my doors locked and call if anything else happened. I could tell by their tone that they didn't think much of my story. Maybe they thought I was being paranoid, but I knew what I had seen. For the next few nights, I barely slept, every sound putting me on edge. I checked the locks repeatedly, made sure the security system was on, and kept the bat by my side at all times. But no matter how much I tried to reassure myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of my security alarm blaring. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing, and grabbed the bat. The alarms panel showed that the back door had been opened. My stomach dropped as I crept downstairs, bat in hand, ready to defend myself. The back door was wide open. I froze in the doorway, my breath caught in my throat. I had locked it. I was sure of it. There was no way it could have opened on its own. As I stood there, staring at the open door, something caught my eye. In the darkness outside, barely visible under the dim light of the moon, was a figure standing at the edge of the yard. A man, tall, with broad shoulders, his face obscured by the shadows. He was just standing there, staring at the house, unmoving. My blood ran cold. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching. I slammed the door shut and locked it, backing away as fast as I could. I grabbed my phone and called the police, my hands shaking as I explained that there was someone outside, watching me. By the time the police arrived, the man was gone. They searched the yard and the surrounding area but found no trace of him. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. They told me it was probably just a prowler, someone passing through, but I knew it was more than that. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the living room, bat in hand, waiting for the figure to return. But he never did. The next morning, I packed my bags and left the house. I couldn't stay there any longer. I didn't care about the cost or the hassle of moving. I just needed to get out. To this day, I don't know who that man was or why he was watching me. All I know is that the sense of dread, the feeling of being watched, never left me. Even now, in a different house, in a different town, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, certain that someone is standing just outside my window, watching.